In this lecture, I will be introducing you to the topics of race and ethnicity. We'll be examining them through the lens of sociology. I will introduce you to a model with which we will understand, I think, more deeply the concept of racism. And then I will also introduce you to some of the ideas of Shirley Better, focusing on her primer regarding not only cultural privilege and institutionalized racism, but also how these two constructs may change over time as the culture itself and the society change as well. But let's begin with the concept of race. And traditionally, race has been viewed as a biological construct. Of course, in the humanities, race has been expanded to incorporate not only biological concepts, but also it has been expanded to include both anthropological and sociological criteria. So, for our purposes, we will define race as a group of people who share inherited characteristics that are both observable and distinguishable, and that this group of individuals can be distinguished by those characteristics from other groups within a society. And that's an important concept here. So it's a group of people sharing inherited characteristics that are observable, that are distinguishable, and that these characteristics, in a sense, will also make them distinguishable from other groups within a society. If we juxtapose that with the topic of ethnicity, we are looking at something that is nearly wholly sociological in nature. So ethnicity is considered to be shared ethos, meaning it's a shared sense of cultural or communal being. Generally, this shared sense of cultural and communal being is found within the concept of a social group. So it does have a physical expression, an observable expression, but needless to say, it is much more akin to the mind of individuals within that group. So to review here, ethnicity is shared ethos, a shared sense of cultural or communal being. Where is it shared? Well, in this case, it is shared among members of a group. To this, let me add a little bit more. So we'll add a second piece to this definition for ethnicity. So additionally, this group will often recognize their members to share a heritage or a common ancestry, proven or otherwise. So the second piece is that members of this group will recognize their membership as having a shared heritage or some sort of common ancestry, proven or otherwise. So the idea here is that when you start to kind of look more critically at these two definitions and take them into consideration throughout the remainder of this lecture and, of course, other associated lectures, what you'll find is that both concepts overlap with one another or they impinge upon one another. There are qualities of both that are observable, and there are qualities of both that are psychological and cultural. There are qualities of both that are used to distinguish individuals, and there are qualities of both that remain hidden. Now, Shirley Better, when she's introducing her primer, her work, at least the second edition of the book, identifies the focus of the book. And so I'd like to point that out for you and get that into your notes. The book, in her words, focuses on an understanding of institutionalized racism. She describes it as something of a social phenomenon, primarily, and that it is a social phenomenon that, in her words, is enduring, meaning it is something that persists. She continues by saying that America, which is going to be of central focus to how we deconstruct cultural privilege and institutionalized racism, America is destined to be increasingly diverse. She's writing in 2008. And in a sense, she's also implying that it is by its nature a diverse society. Now, building on that, she then points out that this diversity, with it comes the idea of challenge. And so she points out that America has challenges and promises that accompany, in this case, not only its diverse nature, but also its nature as a society in constant flux or cultural change. So she sees her writings, she sees, of course, the topics that we'll be touching upon as things that are not static. They're things that are constantly in flux, things that are constantly in change. I think one of the most powerful aspects to her argument and to her work is the focus that she gives to uh, the Hurricane Katrina. She writes, the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. It is unfortunately a classic example of how racism can devastate the innocent. Um, Another way of looking at it as a natural disaster in a coastal community, such as what we have with Hurricane Katrina. This is something that will bring to light many of the inequalities that exist within communities. There may be aspects of the community that are more at risk than others, and generally that risk can be tied to inequality or one's inability to connect to natural resources, the means of production, and other qualities of a society that are important to its survival, how they are connecting to those qualities differently. So again, the kind of moral of the story here is that when we have some sort of disaster, when we have some sort of major political or historical event, not everyone within a society will experience it in the same way. And individuals who are experiencing at the same time some sort of institutional inequality, or they are not able to partake of something like privilege as it relates to economic themes or themes having to do with access to resources, when they're not able to, in a sense, have equal access to that, ultimately they will experience that history, they will experience that event in a very different way. And often it is an experience that results in the loss of life, or it may result in even a greater downturn to their overall life circumstances. So that's something that we're going to also be focusing on, not only in this lecture, but in other lectures as well. In this next slide, I have a very important model. This is going to be you could consider it to be a kind of social spectrum that we will be applying or reflecting on as it relates to historical events, as it relates to associated readings, and of course, major topics, things like race and ethnicity, things like racism, and things like discrimination. And this is really built off of a fairly well-known economic model rather, by Igor Kopytov, a social and anthropological writer and researcher. His commodity spectrum has been something that has been used by, in this case, I would say principally anthropologists to understand change as it relates to the value of objects and ideas in the global marketplace. To give you just a kind of a starting understanding of Kopytov's spectrum, his idea as it relates to commodities is that over time there will be things, objects, ideas that will have no monetary value, but they will increasingly start to take on monetary value. Um, if you think about something like friendship, it can be very easily something that over time can be commoditized, having obligations based upon social relationships and the such. He also pointed out that over time, things that, in a sense, have monetary value may over time lose that monetary value, or it may be changed in some way. A very good example of this would be things like life insurance. If you've ever studied or taken a look at the history of life insurance, you realize that early on, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the idea of putting a price or a value on somebody in their lifetime or even after they have passed away, that's almost abhorrent to people. But over time, that becomes an important practice. And today, as you are um, organizing and developing and building your household, as you start to understand more deeply the concept of family, you increasingly realize that if you were to lose, God forbid, a loved one, and especially a loved one who is a principal contributor to the economics of that household, that you have to in some way ensure that other members of the household will not suffer as a result of that loss, that they should be able to deal with their emotional loss, but not necessarily worry about paying the electric bill. So the idea here is that the human being, let's say a mother or father, on Kopitoff's spectrum moves from a place of no monetary value to one of monetary value because of this additional social concern, and it represents a kind of social change. Well, what we've done here is, and here I've kind of switched over to Kopitov spectrum for just a moment. What we've done here is we see the idea of moving from a commodity status to a non-commodity status, and vice versa. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at, in this case, race and ethnicity through a spectrum-like lens. Okay, so let's now look back at the spectrum that we'll be using for for our purposes and what we'll be studying, not only in this lecture but in others, which is this deference and demeanor spectrum. In this case, deference and demeanor is chosen because the idea of deference or the idea of demeanor really or relates to how we treat one another. If you are to think about a close friend of yours and say, well, what is his or her demeanor? That is something that I think for most of us is pretty easy to assess or to use as some sort of label. We can say, well, that person is generally um, happy, or that person is generally angry or concerned, or that person worries a lot, right? Well, deference and demeanor are going to be terms that we are going to apply to the spectrum because it has a lot to do with attitude and perspective. The idea here is that there are perspectives that are culturally rooted, there are perspectives that are biologically rooted, and there is the role of the world around us, the social institutions that surround us, that we inhabit. So there may be qualities of an individual when you look at them that can be assigned to their biology. Things like skin color or hair color or eye color or the texture of their hair or their stature. These are things that we can see, we can directly observe, and we can assign to them. And there are labels that we apply to that traditionally when we're describing an individual. But then there are things about an individual that we can only understand really indirectly, and that would fall more on the side of culture. The idea that I can look at a food tradition that you and your family has, and I can say, "Wow, that's very much kind of an Eastern European tradition." I can take a look at how you worship, and I can say, "Well, that really is a very much of a Christian tradition," as an example. Or I can take a look at your manner of dress, or I can take a look at a particular kind of annual festival or practice that you partake in. Those are all things that are, in a sense, an indirect measure of one's culture. And so our institutions, these include things such as political institutions or schools or churches or church communities or parish neighborhoods. All of these institutions, in a sense, will draw upon one or the other or a blending of both. And so we have to kind of situate a lot of what we study and what we talk about and what you read about on this spectrum, right? What aspects of how this group of people are being described or treated have to do with their race versus what qualities of that practice, good or bad, can be associated with their ethnicity and ultimately their culture. Well, this spectrum, in a sense, can also be tied to the work of a very important sociologist, Irving Goffman. Goffman, 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 in the 1950s, especially the mid 1950s, really focuses on this idea of sentiment and attitude. He's trying to understand how and why we have the perspectives that we do, and why these perspectives have become institutionalized, and to a lesser extent, how these perspectives have become institutionalized. But then he doesn't really stop there. He moves to the next logical piece of the puzzle, which is how do these perspectives then result in how we treat others or mistreat others? And this becomes the kind of centerpiece to our argument in how we are taking a look at interactions within a social setting. We take a look at how people are treating one another based upon one's appearance, what they see in front of them. We then take a look at how people, individuals, are raised, how they're socialized in a sense, right? How we gain our understanding of our own identity, and then ultimately how this process known as socialization helps us to better understand our place in society and our affiliations within that measurable social setting. And these would be our social institutions. And then we take a look at what we are carrying with us that we can't see. Things are thoughts, right? Things that we are associated with regard to the larger concept of ethnicity. This would include a process like enculturation, right? So we have socialization, where we have the development of our identity and our perspectives as they relate to ourselves and others. And then we have enculturation, right? How the kind of unseen value systems that we carry with us, a sense of right and wrong, ultimately a sense of um, our our ethnicity, how that is being shared with us, and what meanings travel along those lines of sharing. So again, these are the kind of the forces at work in moving objects, events, circumstances, people, groups, and even whole societies. How those things are moving those individuals and experiences and objects along this spectrum. And I think it really helps us to deconstruct major events in American history. If, for example, as Shirley Better points out, we take a look at a natural disaster, we can better understand how groups that are providing aid navigate through the society uh, and the kind of aid that they are providing to those who are at risk. Or we take a look at ultimately how and why, let's say, people of color are experiencing, in this case, a disaster, a natural disaster, in a way that's wholly different than individuals who may self identify or group identify as Caucasian or white. Or we might look at it through an economic lens and say, well, how does a person who lives at or below the poverty line, how do they experience a natural disaster? And is their experience very different from individuals who are considered to be, by the society, more affluent? Right? And so it allows us to kind of break those major subjects and topics down and really understand the mechanisms that are at work. And we are then able to see what kinds of discriminatory practices and discriminatory histories are at work inside of a society over time. So we can see what disadvantages are built into social institutions that very much are, um, in a sense, responsible for socialization and to a lesser extent, enculturation. So, education would be a very good example. If we're to compare schools and their funding and their location and their pupils and their instructors and their instructors' backgrounds, we can start to see potentially how different kinds of social inequalities can start to impact an individual or group's ability to succeed in other educational landscapes or other parts of the educational landscape. And so that becomes very, very important. How much of it is racial? How much of it is cultural? How much of it is social and institutional? The other thing to consider as you're looking at the spectrum and kind of really meditating on it is that there is a real world of things and of relationships. There's a world of people. There's a world of practices. There's a world of economies. There's a world of political perspectives, all of which are being mapped out in this way. It's very easy in academics today to get lost in loftier ideas, to, in a sense, kind of sit in your armchair and not really understand how ideas and how historical events and how social constructs and phenomena are experienced on the ground. You can read about something in a book, right? But actually going and doing it. They're two very different things. You may have experienced this. The idea here, you maybe picked up a how-to manual on fixing a kitchen sink. But it's really not until you go and try to fix the sink that you understand all of the problems, all of the tools, all of the knowledge that is important to accomplishing that task. And so that's something that we really want to make sure to do here as well, to understand the theoretical, but then also understand the practical, that there are real world events and circumstances that are impacted by concepts such as race and ethnicity. And then the final piece of the puzzle, and again, referencing what we are looking at here in terms of this spectrum, is the idea of authenticity as well as the idea of experience. That is, or those are rather, two important topics that we also need to consider as we are navigating topics such as identity and affiliation. So if somebody identifies as Irish American, there are immediately things that we look for, maybe that are visible. But then there are also things that we attempt to look for that are also cultural. And when we're looking for these things, we're trying, in a sense, right, as the outsider, as the observer, who is interacting with an individual who is identifying or self-identifying as Irish American, we're looking to authenticate that individual. So we might ask something about their ancestry, or we might wait to hear about their ancestry. We may wait for or ask a question relating to their foodways or their traditions having to do with dining um, and recipes and things like that. We may ask about linguistic traditions. Are there aspects of Gaelic, for example, or a dialect known as Irish that have worked their way into their linguistic traditions? So on and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that we are looking for or asking about as we attempt to authenticate their self acknowledgement as this ethnic label of Irish American. We also look for experience, and this is something that plays a very important role in how and where we place people on this spectrum. The idea of, well, have you lived like this social or ethnic group? Have you lived or had the same experiences that we associate with historically this racial, social, or ethnic group? And if you haven't, then I may, as the observer, start to call into question how you self identify, or I may, in a sense, as an observer, in a, again, a very theoretical sense, I may situate you differently on this spectrum. And this can also be tied to the idea of empathy. If I am attempting to empathize with somebody who may not um, racially or biologically or ethnically or sociologically um, connect with who I am and the groups, the social groups that I am a part of, then the person I might be interacting with may say, well, you really don't understand, right? You have not experienced what I have experienced, and I am not going to allow you to empathize. I'll let you maybe sympathize if it's in a way that is supportive, or I might let you listen to what I have to say, but I'm not going to necessarily um, tell you that you understand what I'm going through. A very good example that we all can relate to is the loss of a loved one. If you are an individual who has recently or in the past lost somebody very dear to you, either they've moved away or they've passed away, you've lost touch with them, whatever the case might be, for somebody to say to you, well, I understand what you're going through. Sometimes we'll turn around, especially if we're very emotionally fragile at that moment, and say, really, do you? Do you understand what I'm going through? Have you experienced what I've experienced? Well, this is the same kind of concern that also needs to be part of how we situate individuals and objects, events, social groups, societies on this spectrum, and how we move them from one side to the other, or where we place them in a sense. So take a few moments. I know I've hit you with a lot. Take a few moments here and really kind of consider what this model has to offer. And, you know, in a sense, return to this model from time to time as you are looking through a racial or ethnic lens at a historical event, or at a city, or at a community organization, or at a group of individuals, or if you are listening to a narrative or a story told by somebody. Have this readily available and then consider where you might situate this individual based upon what you are hearing, or what you are seeing or observing, or how you might situate this social group or political group based upon their perspectives and their ability, in a sense, to understand otherness, right? The people around them and what they maybe have experienced. This really, in a sense, strikes at the heart of anger in American society. The idea that if I don't understand you, if I don't understand your history, your ethnicity, how you understand your own race, and your experiences, then I may, in a sense, rely on things like stereotypes, which we will definitely address in this course as well. And as such, I will, in a sense, begin to really not relate to you. And there will become a chasm between the two of us that will only grow. But as we start to address things like inequality, and again, Shirley Better very much addresses this in her text, as we start to address things like inequality, and as we start to share information between groups, and as we start to sit across tables and talk about things, we can really start to um, develop bonds between populations or groups that maybe historically have not talked to one another, or have historically hated one another. And then we'll also begin to, in a sense, narrow the divides that exist between us, and eventually turn back the effects of institutionalized racism, cultural privilege, and inequality. So feel free to pause the lecture at this point and kind of organize your notes a little bit and take a look at this visual aid and really try to critically think your way through it. Make notations if you need to, and then start up the video after you've given yourself a little bit of time to do this. All right, let's continue by providing you with a few other topics to get into your notes. In this case, we'll start with a very important piece of the puzzle as it relates to the work of sociologists, in this case, uh, the nature of social institutions. So let's try to develop a less convoluted definition of what a social institution is. And you can paraphrase this in your notes. So, social institutions, in a sense, are very important to how we eventually define ourselves and the groups that we are affiliated with. Social institutions, by their nature, will be a repository or they will house social relationships, meaning people that we spend a lot of time with, people that we interact with on a regular basis, they will be found in these same kinds of social institutions. So, a school, you think of your elementary school that you attended as a child, or your family, right? Sitting around that kitchen table, talking about events, talking about your day. These are individuals who are part of the same social institution. These social institutions will be important because, of course, they will differentiate in terms of their scale, but they will generally be important because they will not only house social relationships, but they will define, or they will come to define the nature of those relationships, who they connect, and ultimately the behaviors that will spring from those relationships. So again, I think the family is a good starting point for understanding that. The idea of who do we connect with in a family environment? Well, people that we are biologically related to, or that people that we live with, or people that we rely on, people who mentor us, people who enculturate us, people who socialize us, and then how our behaviors fit into this is the idea of role playing. The idea that in my family, at least my childhood family, a person like my father was very important in socialization and to a lesser extent enculturation. I would say my mother was a little more of the enculturator, but also he was important for my understanding of my own gender, my identity, and the behaviors that are associated with that, and some of the values that come along with that as well. Social institutions can be physical, they can be things that we can see or observe, but they can also, because of how they function in a society or for a society, right on the cultural side of things, they can, in a sense, be more psychological or sociological in nature. They may not be things that we can directly see or understand. Uh, Whatever a social institution is, however, they will be rigid. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't change over time. What I mean by rigidity here is that they will not change at the same rate that something like a style of clothing may be changing at. So, if you think about a style of clothing as it relates to gender, this generally will change at a much more rapid rate than something like faith or religion. Or if you take a look at clothing or the idea of a social value relating to a new technology, that will change at a much more rapid rate. I should, instead of saying new technology, I should just say a technology. That will change at a much more rapid rate than something like language, right? Or a particular kind of language, right? We might say that terms or expressions having to do with family will change or adapt in a more gradual way than terms that we may associate with something like technology. So, a social institution, in a sense, should be considered more on the rigid side of things, things that are by their nature, institutions, in a sense, by their nature, are things that change at a much slower rate than other topics or concepts in popular media or popular culture. And it is these kinds of units, in the case, a unit or a definition, if you want to look at it that way, such as race, or a definition or unit of social measurement, such as ethnicity, or a unit like uh, a social institution, or how we use that term or expression. These are things that are things that a sociologist will pay attention to, that he or she will monitor, um, because it's when social institutions begin to change that we know we are a part of what Shirley Better is describing as a major social or cultural change. And in 2008, when Shirley Better wrote the second edition of her primer on social change and how she looked at institutionalized racism in the United States, especially the United States, was very much her focus. She realized that in this case, uh, it's important as to what we are observing in that process of change. As for her, the United States is moving into the 21st century. As for us, we see it continue to navigate through the 21st century. We realize that when important social institutions begin to change, as we start to see a complete reformation of sorts regarding how we define family and how we self identify and how we identify and relate to concepts like gender or an ethnicity or a racial identity such as African American or indigenous, um, or Irish American. As we start to see the mechanisms, the social structures around these larger and historically well established labels, ideas, perspectives, as we start to see those things change, then we know that is something that we are and should pay closer attention to. And it is something that, in a practical sense, moving from theory to practice, in a practical sense, we can start to address as it relates to the society itself and where that society might be headed. So, as you begin to more deeply understand the topics of race and ethnicity through this lecture series, and of course through the related texts that we'll be taking a look at, and of course through related coursework, one of the things that I want you to do is to continue to evaluate what you are looking at and the importance that it may or may not have as it relates to social and cultural change.